You're listening to Job Tales, the podcast where people from all walks of life tell their professional story so that you can find inspiration for your own career. Today we have John McGonigle, independent watchmaker. Thank you, John, for accepting my invitation. First question I have, what makes you an independent watchmaker?
Yeah, I suppose we are independent watchmakers as distinct from watchmakers who would be working for a company or indeed a watchmaking brand itself, because we're both watchmaker and brand. We design our work, we make our work, we market and sell our work, whereas even just to produce a watch, the watch would pass through various different departments with specialists in each department to work in different areas of the watch. An independent watchmaker will work on everything himself. And that's very unusual nowadays.
Is it?
Well, you have to master an awful lot of skills to be able to do that. You have to be able to work at every part of the watch. And as I say, you end up having to market and sell your watches as well, which is probably the least favorite part for a lot of independent watchmakers. The designing and making of all elements of the watch, it's fantastic. It really is kind of the dream for a watchmaker to be able to do that, because it's something that most of us always aspired to when we were learning our trade. And I feel really lucky to have reached that point.
Oh, that's great. Actually, let's go at the beginning of your trade and becoming a watchmaker. What do you need to do to become an apprentice watchmaker or to study watchmaking?
The most common route is to find a watchmaking school. Myself and my brothers, three of us are watchmakers in my family. We all went to a school in Dublin in Ireland, and it was set up by the Swiss. But unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. It closed down in the early 2000s. You've watchmaking schools in Switzerland. One of them is an international school, so it takes students from all over the world. You've schools in countries throughout the world. That's the most direct and probably the best route to becoming a watchmaker. Otherwise, some companies will take on apprentices. It's very difficult to find a watchmaker to take on an apprentice, because an apprenticeship will take about 3 years, and so it's a big commitment for an employer, and generally only large companies can take on apprentices. The disadvantage with that is they will only train you on their own products, whereas going to a dedicated watchmaking school will, or at least it should, train you across the broad spectrum of watchmaking, from historical watches right up to the modern.
And what did inspire you to become a watchmaker?
My father, he didn't work as a watchmaker as his profession. He used to work on watches and clocks for a hobby. And a lot of people ended up bringing repairs to him. So we grew up in a house with other people's clocks all over our walls and mantelpieces. So that was the start of it. But I was always interested in mechanical things, and it was inevitable that I was going to end up working in some branch of mechanics. But my father was the one who provided the idea for watchmaking.
For the three of you, actually.
Yeah. And well, I like to think, because I was the first, that the others copied me.
Of course.
But they'll say different. No, our father was the inspiration.
At what stage of your, let's say, learning background do you start studying watchmaking? Like, is it in lieu of high school? Is it like a university degree? How do you start?
Traditionally, guys would start quite young, maybe about the age of 15. So it'll be an apprenticeship where they'd start quite young. Nowadays, it's more common that people would start after high school. So it'll be a third level qualification.
Okay. And what are the subjects that you learn?
It was in the 1980s when I was in the watchmaking school. Seems like an awful long time now. But in addition to the practical bench work, which took up most of the course because it is very much very hands-on as a course. You have to really learn how to scale down and learn how to increase your manual dexterity. And it takes about a year before you actually start working properly on watches at all. So for the first part, we were making our own tools, and then we started on clocks, and then we started on pocket watches, and then increasingly the watches got smaller and smaller. So if you're handed a watch on day one, you just wouldn't be able to work on it. But in addition to that, we studied electronics because, of course, you have electronic watches, and we studied mechanics, and we also had French and English. We had mechanical drawing. So yeah, that's pretty much the range of subjects we had.
And then lots of practice, I imagine. And do you feel that you had a particular skill that made you very apt to this job?
I suppose persistence. I would stick at it, but clearly from early on, it was evident that some people are suited to it. You know, they have a good manual dexterity, and it's you can see it in the first week that someone has the touch. And I guess I had, I found it very enjoyable, and I found it difficult. We all did, but I was just learning faster than the others, I guess. Well, I mean, there were a lot of good watchmakers in my class, but I was one of the ones who was learning at a good rate. Having said that, you'd go through weeks where you would feel like you were no good, because it always, I think learning for anyone is always very difficult. And so you'd have times when you'd feel very good about how you're progressing, then other times where you'd feel, I'm never going to get this. But I stuck at it. So I think persistence is also a very necessary component.
And what do you like most in your job? Like which part of the process?
I like various parts, but I think there are parts that are very, very repetitive. There's an awful lot of preparation. In fact, I would say that maybe 70% of the work is preparing parts. So it's not very, very, it involves skill, but the really enjoyable part is when you're problem solving. And so when all the components are made and now you're trying to get them to work together, and so you're removing material, with so many different components in the watch, if you make an adjustment to one component, you can affect the other side of the watch if you don't really consider how it fits with all of the systems that are working together. And I find that particularly enjoyable. But also, I love machining. I love on the jig bore or on the milling machine or on the lathes. It's very satisfying just taking a piece of metal and just machining it until it becomes a component.
Because I know nothing or almost nothing about watches, can you name a few components, like the names of the components that you were talking about?
Some of the components are kind of obvious because of their appearance. Like one of the thinnest and longest components that's coiled up, and it's very visual. When you look in the back of a watch, you can see this wheel oscillating back and forth, and the spring that actually makes it return from each cycle is called a hairspring. And when you see it, you kind of go, yeah, well, I can see why that's called a hairspring. It's so thin. We have watches called minute repeaters, or repeater watches, and what they would chime the time on gongs. So the gongs screwed to the outside of the watch, and the components that would actually produce the sound are called hammers. And again, they look like hammers and act like hammers. I think watchmakers have always been pretty pragmatic. They didn't reach for the poetry book when they started naming components. The components describe what the part does in the main, and so without even looking at a watch, a watchmaker can talk to another watchmaker and say, the operation levers working with the column wheel, and you have a jumper spring, and the other watchmaker can literally visualize what has been described because the components describe themselves.
And did you work for some major brands before you created your own brand?
I did. Well, I worked for one major brand. I worked for Audemars Piguet for 5 years in the Vallée de Joux, which is the home of Audemars Piguet. And that was a wonderful experience. Both working for a company like Audemars was fantastic. There's such a history there. There's a great depth of knowledge. There were some wonderful characters working there as well, guys who had spent their entire careers there. And so that aspect was wonderful. But also living up in the Vallée de Joux was a real cultural experience as well. So you're really been immersed in a Swiss mountain valley and everything that goes with that.
It's a mountain valley full of watchmakers, right? It's like the Mecca of watchmaking.
It really is, and I suppose you probably have the greatest concentration of people, working in the watch industry compared to the rest of the population. You have other areas where you have an awful lot of watchmakers, such as the Chaux-de-Fonds-le-Lac area. I worked up there as well for a further 2 years with a company called Christophe Claret, and I really enjoyed that. It was a small company making very, very complex watches. So I worked there developing prototypes. So I was working on watches for the first time that had never worked before, and we didn't know if they would work because they were development watches. So it was scary and exciting in equal measure, but it was hugely fulfilling. I learned so much there.
And what is the production timeline of a watch? Like in your case, you produce your own watches. How long for you to make one watch?
At the moment, it takes about 8 weeks, and there's a lot of hand, there's hand finishing throughout. I'm using existing movements, but I'm completely taking them apart and rebuilding them and I'm replacing some components of ones I make myself and modifying other components and refinishing and redecorating all of the components. So it's very time consuming, very labor intensive.
And I also see that, you have a lot of suppliers, I imagine, because of all the different components. Is that also a big part of your job to actually source the right suppliers?
It is, and it can be frustrating because, again, dealing with suppliers can take you away from every aspect of the business end of watchmaking, be it dealing with clients or marketing or suppliers. It takes you away from your core work, which is working at the bench or working on machines. Working with suppliers can be tricky because you're working generally over the phone or over the computer, and you're sending files of technical drawings, and you're describing what exactly you want and everything like that. And so that in itself can take up some time, and very often things can get lost in the mix. So when the components eventually arrive after a very long wait, they mightn't be exactly what you want. So you have to redesign or have those conversations again. And it's always easier. And I mean, that's no reflection on the suppliers. It's just easier for me to take a piece of metal and make something myself. It's an easier process, even though it's slow and it's very time consuming. I try to be selective about which areas I do myself and which areas I get done by suppliers. And I try to find the most effective way of just getting a finished watch by combining the two.
Do you combine also mechanical and digital in your watches?
I don't. First of all, everything is mechanical. I don't use electronic systems or The watches are all spring powered. They're purely mechanical. So I'm using wheels and systems of cams, levers, springs, and that's essentially it.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it's great to keep such a craft and such a tradition. And actually, that makes me wonder what attracts people to watches so much. Like there are, collections and collector pieces. And what do you think is so precious about watches?
I think different people will tell you different things. The things that attract me to watches mightn't necessarily be the thing that attracts a lot of collectors to watches. But for me, I find there's something jewel-like, something very precious about a watch, even simple watches that may not be very expensive. Like I grew up having a fascination with watches, and at the time, the thought of a watch costing more than a few hundred sounded like a lot to most people, myself included. And when I first came across watches costing over 1,000, this seemed ludicrous, And I mean, we've gone very far since. The mechanics were what really fascinated me. Opening up the back of the watch and seeing the jewels and all the small little components. There's a real beauty there. And then when you actually see it, start to function without wanting to sound too airy fairy about it, it's almost like it has a life, So you're taking base metals, you're taking brass, you're taking steel, you're filing them, you're making the components delicate and delicate enough to fit inside the watch and with a very light function so that they can function within this system. And they take on value. So you're adding value to basically very cheap materials. And sorry, this is before you put them in a precious gold case and precious stones and that sort of thing. So the mechanics were really what fascinated me. But I think just placing a watch in someone's hand already creates a fascination, and that is harder to explain.
No, it's beautiful. I'm looking at your website right now, and this watch you've made. It looks really beautiful, and I guess it could also it could work forever, from what I can see. Can you say what the name of your watch, because it's an Irish, and I would like to say it properly.
It's a bit of a challenge. I've actually put the phonetic pronunciation on the website and wherever I can, because it's not pronounced the way it's written. It's pronounced Ilon.
Alone.
Yeah. I think if you were to pronounce it the way it's written, you'd pronounce it Olean.
Olean, yes, that's what I was. But it's alone.
It's an Irish word for island, and I was looking for a word that would describe my situation. I think Ilon describes my situation both geographically and culturally within watchmaking. I'm making watches on an island, and I'm very far away from the rest of the watch industry. So I thought Ilon was appropriate.
If you could go back in time, would you do something different?
I think I made good progress because I made a lot of good decisions early on. And, subsequently, there are things that I could have done better to grow quicker. But I think I always tried to choose experience over money. So I think that was the right thing to do, certainly in the beginning. Rather than trying to find a job that would pay more money, I was trying to find jobs that where I could gain more experience. And I kept doing that. And maybe at some point I should have stopped doing that and just started making money. But there are always areas where you could say, listen, if it's that a bit differently, I'd arrive at where I want to be much quicker.
How many years do you think is an average to become a good watchmaker?
Generally, most watchmaking courses are 3 years, but when you come out, you really just the basic skills. Then I think, depending on where you go, if someone gets into a company where they've really high grade watches, and you get to work beside someone who's got fantastic experience and is willing to teach you, because that's not always the case. And then there's the watches themselves. You have to be working on watches that where you can learn the skills of working in all the different areas of the watch. It's not very easy to find those jobs, and for watchmakers who can't find a job working on high grade handmade watches, I would say the best thing you could do is to do restoration. Find a good restoration workshop and work there for a number of years. But I think to become really good, it takes about 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
Which, on top of the 3 years, it's not bad. Because I think in most professions, when you come out of college or university, you might think you know it all, but like anyone in a given industry will tell you that you really are just starting.
Yeah, and then between internships and being an assistant here, assistant there, then it does take another, extra 2-3 years to become independent. Let's say, like to be able to do things independently, even if you're working for a company.
I would say most watchmakers would take about 10 years to get really comfortable with what they're doing, like really productive. But up until that, you can be very handy and you can get very, very good. So yeah, I think about 4 to 5 years you can really become decent.
Okay. Are there any myths around your job?
Oh, there's so many. And I think it's because everybody has a watch. There's a familiarity, and yet so many inaccuracies as a result. Very often people would bring a watch or a clock to you and say, I just overwound it. And there is no such a thing as I don't know if they say that in Italy, but like overwinding means nothing. It's just if you wind it and it doesn't work anymore, it's because it's blocked. It's because there's a blockage somewhere. But is something that everybody says, at least here. The other thing you'd hear people say would be that we brought it to a bad watchmaker and we think he took the jewels out. Again, all of the jewels are synthetic, and if you took the jewels out, it wouldn't work. You'd have to replace the jewels with something else. They're bearings. So, you have things like that, you have funny things like that. But I think even collectors, though, have funny misconceptions about watches, about how much is handmade and, who makes what. You can't blame them, because I think a lot of the myths can be perpetuated by people in the watch industry, because it's a good narrative for them to tell. It helps them sell watches, but you just kind of quietly shake your head when you hear some of the stories.
Do you find there are enough watchmakers in the world, or is it a dying craft?
It's curious because there's probably never as many high-end watches sold as there is now, and the demand is quite enormous at the moment. It's amazing right at this moment. But I think the watch industry has tried to almost engineer watchmakers out of the making process. They're using more advanced machines to replace processes that were done by hand. Even in the after-sales service, where in times past, the only way of servicing a watch was to give it to one watchmaker. He or she would strip it down completely, clean it, build it back up again, do whatever repairs are necessary. But now you have systems where, for certain brands, where the watches are stripped down to component form, and all of the components are put back into the system. If there's any wear or anything, to discard it, and the watch is rebuilt again, almost as if it's a new watch, by these semi-automated system. Now, you would have people in the system, but they wouldn't have full watchmaking skills. They would be trained in a very narrow area, and they would be very, very good at that, but they wouldn't be able to work on other parts of the watch. So that's increasing, and the end result is there is not enough fully trained watchmakers in the world, and there aren't enough in Switzerland, and there certainly aren't enough throughout the world to take care of the watches that are out there. And collectors of very high-end watches can tell you that it can take a long time to get a watch back after it's been sent in for service. So it's an issue.
Yeah, for sure. My last question is, how many watches do you plan to make this year?
About 8.
About?
8.
Oh,
Yeah.
really? Wow.
And it's not because I'm not trying, it's just they're very slow to make. And I had to recently stop taking orders because I can only make so many. It's just it's the nature of the watch.
Yeah.
You can see from the website, the hand finish and the decoration is very elaborate throughout. There are a lot of components in that watch, so
Yeah.
it's very, very slow to do all of that work. If I can work with other watchmakers in time, and I'd very much like to increase production, but like as things stand, I'm working on my own, and that's as much as I can make in a year.
John values quality over quantity. This is an important message for our modern times. Large scale is not the only driver of today's economy. If you have comments and new interviews to propose, you know where to find me. Thank you for listening.